super excited to be here talking to you guys about localization. I have some closed captions on my slides that hopefully picks up the mic, so I'm going to stand pretty close to my computer. My name is Isabela Moreira. Before we dive in, I like to talk about two things about myself so we have a little bit more context on who I am. I got a really good intro, but we missed a few things. The first is this is my dog. I like to put him in all my slides because I think he's really cute. And the second is, like we mentioned, I work at a tiny startup in Seattle called Cedar AI. And we work on railroad technology, so like actual trains. And the entire industry is still run on pen and paper, which is terrifying. And so we have a lot of really unique challenges that come along with that. And so a lot of my talks kind of focus on things that I've learned as I kind of just do everything because we're only 10 developers. And so I'm super excited to be talking about localization here in this international conference. It seems like a pretty fitting topic, so let's get started. So a few things about what we'll cover before we jump in. First, we're going to look at what localization is, the differences between localization and internationalization, and that's a really big word, and I'm not going to say that very often. We're going to look at why it's important when we're talking about a product that we're trying to ship. And then we're going to look at how we actually implement localization in both the React and just vanilla JavaScript apps. And then our favorite part, testing localization. So what is localization? It's adapting a product to meet not only language, but also cultural requirements. And so this includes numeric, date, and time formats, currency and measurements, keyboard usage, how different languages or cultures might interact with things differently, symbols, icons, and colors, legal requirements that you might have at your company, and any text or graphics or anything that could be insensitive or inappropriate for a specific culture. So it's super simple, right? Like everything your user sees is fair game to be localized. So localization versus internationalization both share the same goal, but internationalization is more of a broad term that describes the overall process of sort of setting up the infrastructure of your app to actually support being shipped on a global scale. And usually when we talk about localization, it's getting more into the details of how we implement this for your specific product. So internationalization makes it a lot easier to provide a localized product. And like retrofitting a linguistically and culturally centered like feature for a global market is a lot harder than just like doing it right from the beginning. And so not 100% relevant, but this like kind of think back to the Y2K effort, and like everyone was freaking out, like how do we get our machines to handle like 2000 for the year, because all of these systems were built under the assumption that we lived in the 1900s, which is exciting. So the end result is to remove barriers to localization, and this comes through bidirectional text support, so supporting left and right to languages, Unicode support, because not everyone uses Latin-based characters, string concatenation, and we're going to look a lot at this later. It's bad, don't do it. And then mostly like a support for dynamic UI. You never want to have hard-coded strings in your app, because a hard-coded string will never be able to be localized. So this is important because we want to expand our user base. Only about a quarter of internet users worldwide speak English. And then from that, only 3/4 of internet users are spread across the top 10 languages. So if your app only supports English, like no one's going to use it pretty much. It's important because we want to be sensitive across all cultures. We want to build a very inclusive and diverse product. And kind of in that aspect, we want to have very in-context localization that focuses on the quality and the experience of a product rather than just straight functionality and doing just like a one-to-one translation of something. So a few great examples of why good localization is important. When KFC fried chicken was being brought into the Chinese market, their slogan is, "It's finger licking good," right? Because you eat fried chicken with your hands. And they translated it directly into Chinese without thinking about the context of this. And so they translated it to "eat your fingers off." It didn't really go over so well. A little bit of a more serious one, when I was working at Microsoft, we actually saw this issue come in with our Visual Studio installer. It showed a specific image that was considered very offensive in Chinese culture. And someone from the community opened up a bug on us and was saying, hey, like, this is what's wrong, this is why it's important. And we jumped in and fixed it pretty much right away because it was alienating a whole subset of users. Last one, this is some random whitening toothpaste, and they were like launching this campaign to advertise in a specific like area in Southeast Asia, and they were saying like, we're great, we whiten your teeth. And they didn't really do any market research, and they didn't realize that the people in that area don't really value white teeth for whatever reason. That's part of their culture. And so they basically completely failed. And so understanding your market and your audience, like maybe they could have marketed their product a different way that would have actually connected with their customers. So some of our goals for implementation, before we kind of jump in, is we want to have a single source of truth. We should never have any confusion about what underlying English string or whatever string you're using as your base language is the correct one. Things like cancel versus dismiss versus whatever, you should never have to decide between those kinds of words. Then our infrastructure should be able to handle an arbitrary number of languages. There shouldn't really be any upper bound to how many languages we can support, and it should require minimal to no dev effort once we have an infrastructure set up to add new languages. And so from this, we should have a very decoupled implementation where we can add translations and we can develop features in parallel and as independent from each other as possible. And of course, because we're great developers, everything should be automated as much as possible just to make things more efficient and less error-prone. So one library that you may run into when you're looking at this stuff is REACT-INTL. And I'm just going to say INTL because it's easier. This is an OK solution for very simple React apps, but it doesn't support vanilla JavaScript. And so even if you have some React app, if you're trying to use some localization in like a generic JavaScript or TypeScript file, you're not going to be able to do that because this pretty much only supports like in a React environment because it uses this HOC to inject its functionality. So already from the start, this breaks our decoupling goal because when we're developing features, now we need to keep in mind that they have to be in a React app and they have to be HOC wrapped, and it's just a lot going on. So the best alternative that I found is confusingly named REACT-INTL-UNIVERSAL. And despite the name, it actually supports vanilla JavaScript. And so basically, the way that this guy works is you have a JSON file that defines all of your strings and your different locales. And then in your JavaScript file, you just do an intl.get call, and you give it the string for whatever value you're trying to get. So this setup is really nice because your strings are separated from your app, and you don't actually have any hard-coded values anymore. But we are still just in English, which is bad. So we're going to dig into a little bit more implementation details for how we actually pull new languages in. But first, I want to kind of dig into some more areas that this library helps us handle and things that we have to keep in mind when we're doing these localizations. So for this to work in many languages, a message has to be written and translated as a single unit. So typically, this string is like placeholder syntax for variable elements, which we saw before. Like we have hello and then some name. And that's fine if like the variable that you're trying to give doesn't have to be translated. Like you would never translate a proper noun or somebody's name. But you should also never concatenate your own strings. So like, oh, I'm going to translate this first part, give it some variable, translate this other part. Because not only does it make this very hard for translators to understand the full context of your message, but you could get entirely wrong context when you're translating. And a lot of times this happens with languages that have gendered nouns, and so you could have an adjective that's the wrong gender for the word that you're trying to use. So it's helpful to be very explicit when translating strings. And usually in programming, you like hear this concept that your code needs to be dry, which means don't repeat yourself. But in the context of localization, we want our code to be very wet, which means we want everything translated. I came up with that one, so you're welcome. You're never going to forget it. So that's where this ICU message format comes into play. It's a programming language agnostic format for translating strings, and it defines all sorts of different like functions and different ways that we should handle things. So drawing from these guidelines, here's what a very basic translation would look like using only strings. So here on the left side, you can see this is the do. This is, let's say I want to show a message that says we have no data. And so in this particular case, it's we have no messages. And so in my English translation, I will actually translate the full string, no new messages. And then in my Portuguese translation, I will translate the entire string, sem novas mensagens. And so when I actually do my intl.get call, I will just have the entire string. What I don't want to do is like, I'm a super sneaky programmer, and I'm just like, I have a ton of data types that I need to show empty states for. So I'm just going to say no new, and then I'm just going to pass it whatever variable I want. And what happens is we end up getting the wrong like gender for new in Portuguese. We get novos instead of novas because we don't know what type of like data type variable we're passing in. So that's like a really big one to watch out for. Then following those guidelines, the ICU message format looks like this. The first parameter is a variable name. Now, variables aren't evil. You should just be cautious of when to use them. And so in a lot of these examples, our variables will be things like numbers and dates that we want localized. So then the second parameter is going to be the type of the value that's being passed in. So like number, date, time, and then there's a special one for plural, and we're going to look into that in a bit. And then the third parameter is the format. And it's optional, but it provides some additional context into how the value should be displayed. So let's look at the pluralization stuff first, because that's like probably the most in-depth one we're going to look at. Basically, this acts as a giant switch statement. So the keyword plural that we pass into our JSON file is going to have equals some number, and you can have as many different things as you want in there. And if it hits that case in your statement, then it's going to translate whatever string is in those curly braces. And then the other keyword acts as like default in a switch statement. So then localization doesn't mean just translating strings. We kind of touched a little bit on this already. But as probably everyone here knows, especially if you're not American, people hate the American date format. It's terrible. And a global product launch from an American-based company would probably be a disaster if they didn't localize their date formats. And so this library gives us a really nice way of doing that. We just specify that we're trying to localize a date, and then the third parameter is basically like, oh, if we want to show the entire date, if we want to show it with the month or without the month, things like that. And so similarly, we want to do the same thing for times, and we'll pass in a time as our type, and then we will get some localized things. So like, we Americans love AM, PM. I don't know why. But for everywhere else, you would probably want to use a 24-hour time. And so this is really a nice way of handling that. And then similarly, for a number, we can pass in a number. And in here, we get this format. And so we can say the type of number we're passing in, since we're passing in USD, means that we're trying to translate or localize a currency. And this currency code just comes from the ISO standards website. So it's all like super standardized. And this is all great, but we still have hard-coded stuff. We still have like USD in our last example. So now let's look at how we actually implement this in a React or vanilla JavaScript app. So some of our goals is to make it very low friction for our users, is we want to automatically detect the user's locale. And then to kind of round out the user experience, we want to allow them to change their locale. And then we want to leverage common locale data whenever we can. And so when you're doing this in the browser, instead of like maybe in some node or backend code, things like date, currency, and number formats will get automatically loaded from a CDN on demand, depending on what language we initialize our library with. So the first thing we can do is determine what the user's current locale is. So my examples are going to be in React just for the sake of simplicity and time, but keep in mind that you can use this library with pretty much any JavaScript library or framework or file. So you might just need to tweak some of this code. So like, for example, in here, we're going to say that when our component mounts, we're going to load our locale. We might do this with like a window load function in a vanilla JavaScript app. So here's what it looks like to actually load the user's locale. So the library that we're using can determine the locale from either a URL parameter. So like a lot of times you'll see $lang equals some code, or a locale cookie. And so we can say that it's a pretty safe bet that if this locale isn't set, we will just default to English or whatever language you want to use. And then from there, we will initialize the library with the data required for that locale. So when we pass in this current locale string, the library is going to give you access to all the common locale data. And this is what we're going to use for like currency and dates and times. And then what I like to do is use a library called JSON Loader, and that's going to allow us to dynamically require the JSON file for the particular locale that we want to use. And so in here, we just do require JSON bang and then the path to whatever locale JSON file we're using. And that's really nice because we don't want to import a billion language files and just like have them sitting around never using them. And so this lets us keep things pretty concise. So now we want to set up a way for the users to change their locale. And so we can kind of think about maybe making a drop-down of all the supported languages. And so in here, we're just going to create an array of the name, which is whatever is going to show up in the drop-down, and then the value, which is going to be the actual locale code that we're going to pass into the library. And so now we can say that our drop-down has some on-change event or whatever. And maybe if we're doing a vanilla JavaScript app, we can update our location in our URL to reflect like the ? language. And so then our library will pick up that change. Or we can, if we're doing it in React, we can maybe set some state somewhere. And so if we're doing this in React, we can say that when we actually go to determine the locale, we can read from the app state instead of from whatever value is returned as the default language. And then kind of going back to the idea that localization includes not just translating strings and numbers, but also includes thinking about how we deal with symbols and images. we can actually use our current locale information from the library to determine if we want to maybe render a different element. And so we can kind of like rabbit hole on this, but just for the sake of simplicity, we can just get the current locale from the library. And so like in this case, if our locale is French, then maybe we will render a different icon in this particular area. So I know we've covered a lot about how we localize strings across our product, but an important aspect of like getting this ready to ship is testing to make sure that we haven't missed any strings. And so like maybe you're thinking that you only know one language, or you don't want to like fiddle with manually testing if strings are translated by like faking your locale or going to a different user setting, and now you're stuck and like you can't unchange the language and it's this mess. And so to solve this, we can use a strategy called pseudo-localization. And by leveraging this, we basically force our dev environment to use a specific locale file. And this locale file is going to return Unicode text that closely matches Latin characters, but looks pretty obviously different with various like accent marks and ligatures that you can see in this screenshot. It's still like pretty recognizable text, and this is actually from some Windows build that I took when I was working there. But basically, like if you're in this dev environment, you can clearly see that like all of this text has been translated because it looks pretty funny. But it's also very easy to visually tell what strings haven't been localized. And so here we can see that cancel still shows up in like our normal font. So we know that we need to take care of this. It's probably hard-coded somewhere deep in our code base, and we just like never found it. So the way I like to handle this is using CLI tools to generate these pseudo-localized JSON files. And so I use this package called pseudo-localization because it does pseudo-localization. And basically, you npm install it, and then you're like doing your app, and you're like ready to test. And so from there, you can run npx pseudo-localization, and you give it the base JSON file that you want to use. So like in my case, I'm just going to give it the English JSON data. And then I'm going to give it the path to where I store all of my locales, and then give it some name. So here I call it pseudo.json. Then from there, when you go to load your locale in your app, you can check your process environment, and if it's in your dev environment, then you can just automatically require the pseudo-localized version of your JSON data. And then otherwise, you'll just require your regular localized file. And so that solves the problem from a manual testing standpoint, but we're great engineers, and we have all these automated tests set up, and they're all failing now. And so what we want to do is set up our tests to make sure that they pass again, but also that they catch any non-localized strings. And this is really nice because it kind of breaks apart the tests from whatever locale you're using. And so that kind of helps with our decoupling goal. So this is pretty simple to do. This is just a just test. It's super basic. And I just get some element, and I grab the text from it. And instead of expecting it to equal some hard-coded string, I just do my intl.get call with whatever key I'm using. And it doesn't matter what locale I'm running this test under, the values will line up. So kind of to wrap things up, hard-coded strings are terrible. Even if you're not quite ready to jump into localization, moving strings into their own JSON file just helps to kind of keep things separated. And it's a pretty big stepping stone to not only making your code base cleaner, but helping you be prepared for when you eventually do want to ship globally and localize your product. Translate messages as a single unit, so minimize string variables when you're like doing those calls, but also don't concatenate strings because that leads to all sorts of grammar issues. Use REACT-INTE-UNIVERSAL and pseudo-localization. I mean, I'm sure there's other options, but these are the best ones that I found and pretty much what I use in all of my products. Don't DIY localization. There's just so much stuff involved in localization, and there's so many weird edge cases. It's just better to use a library. Thanks. That's my dog.